All right, welcome back to On the Ball, the video podcast series from the Vanderbilt Sports and Society Initiative. Really excited to have a colleague of mine here at the Vanderbilt Athletic Department as our guest, Dr. Tess Kilwein, joining us. She's just written an article for Psychology Today on the sexual violence prevention in sport. And Tess, I was mentioning before we hit record, like I feel like I see your byline every month, and you said that's true, right? You're a productive writer in addition to what you're doing here at Vanderbilt. But thank you so much for joining the show.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
And did I pronounce your last name right? I realize I've just always seen it in writing, but I don't think I've ever seen your last name out loud before. So,
Yes, it's Kilwine.
okay, great. All right. Well, Tess, before we get into the meat of the subject here, like, can you give us a little bit of your background on how you got into sports psychology and to psychology in general?
Absolutely. So I'm currently a clinical sports psychologist for Vanderbilt Athletics. So I work with our student athletes and provide consultation to coaches and staff here. But prior to this position, I was a trauma specialist. So more of the work that I was actually doing and a lot of the training throughout my career as a psychologist has been in trauma. And so that is, on college campuses in particular, interpersonal violence is unfortunately very common, right? So sexual violence, domestic violence, abuse. So a lot of my initial training throughout graduate school was focused on working with survivors of trauma in forms of violence. I didn't make the switch over to sports psychology until I was actually kind of consulting around trauma and policy and protocols around what that looks like in athletic settings in particular. So I've always, had athleticism at the core of my identity and my family and always mattered a lot to me. But I was able to sort of find my way into sports psychology and bring with it some of the other specializations like trauma that I've had for quite some time.
Okay, very interesting. Okay, what's that athletic background in your life and in your family?
Yes, yeah. My father was a wrestler for Team USA, and he was, had his sights set on Olympics, but it was unfortunately the year that the USA boycotted
Oh,
participation in the Olympics. So he, that was his goal. That's where he was going to go, and unfortunately didn't get to go that year. And 4 years later, had a career-ending injury in the trials. So.
okay.
Knowing his story, my parents met through his athletic participation. My mom was a journalism major and writing a story about him. And so just kind of hearing his story. And then, sport was a big part of my identity throughout high school as well. I was a college volleyball or a volleyball, basketball, and track and field athlete. Also planned to play in college and had a career-ending injury myself. So I was in a pretty nasty car accident towards the end of high school and didn't end up playing in college. But always found myself connected through reffing, through coaching, through lots of different avenues. And so it's no wonder I found my way back to sports psychology at some point.
Right. Wow. Okay. And then I think for people who, are not in an athletic department every day and they think about sports psychology, they may think about it in a couple of different ways, related to performance, but also related just to the human, regardless of performance. How is that dealt with in athletic spaces these days?
Sure. There's a variety of models, right? And so there's really kind of two aspects of what sports psychologists do. They do the mental performance side of sport, and then they do the mental health side of sport. Some folks are dually trained in providing performance psychology to athletes and performance populations as well as mental health, and some just do one of both. So the model at Vanderbilt is that all three of our providers are dually trained in providing mental health support to student athletes as well as mental performance services. So you might have the athletes that are really focused on optimizing their performance in sport and focusing around that area. Some athletes who are navigating mental health challenges, maybe balancing difficulties, balancing all of the demands at them, family history. And some people do a little bit of a combination of both, right? So it really just depends on the individual student athlete.
Yeah, and I assume, I mean, it's all connected anyway, right? To a large
Yeah,
degree, probably.
there's a lot of discussion around that of really is it two separate things? Sometimes it is, and sometimes it's not.
Okay, okay. All right, well, let's get into the article you wrote. Again, the headline was Sexual Violence Prevention in Sport, a call to action emphasizing institutional over individual responsibility. And, as we think about this issue, I wondered, is there something inherent to sports that makes sexual violence more prevalent or any different than other aspects of life?
Sure. And it's not necessarily sport itself, right? Sport is not to blame for sexual violence, but what we do find in particularly subsets of populations that there are elevated risk of sexual violence. So if we look at college campuses in particular, there's certain subsets like Greek life on campus, athletic participation, sometimes ROTC, we're seeing some of those rates come out. And that's the same as the general public, right? So we have elevated rates in military populations and just different communities. So there's a few aspects of it. One, the co-ed nature can create these really kind of intimate interactions between different athletes or between coaches and staff and athletes, as it's such an intimate thing that we do, right? We're using our bodies, we're performing at really high levels. We spend a lot of intimate time together, traveling on the road, practice. It's community, right? So anytime there's a community that maybe spends a lot of time together, we're going to see some elevated rates in that way. There are some other unique aspects of sport that have been identified in the literature, like higher rates of hyper-masculinities, higher rates of, not necessarily aggression, but sort of this need to like be tough, be strong, dominance we see sometimes in the sport world. So some of those aspects we see are specific to gender, but not all of them. So power structures are a big aspect of sport, is it's a really hierarchical type of thing, right? So you've got administrators and coaches and people on the top, all the way down to sometimes really vulnerable athletes, especially in our youth leagues, right? So sometimes when we see these power structures, we see forms of violence come out of that as well.
Okay. And I guess related to that, power dynamics,
Mhm.
a lot of the high profile cases have involved coaches. Sometimes we hear about an athlete and another athlete or another student. But, when I was just sort of Googling on this issue before the interview, there multiple pages come up of cases of coaches and athlete at all levels, from youth sports to high school to college, professional, Olympics. Is That's, I assume, a prime example of what you're talking about. And do you find like these coaches is it the reason why they're entering coaching in the first place? Like that they're to prey on people as a byproduct of that power imbalance that it comes across as unexpected, a byproduct of that, or what's involved in that dynamic?
Wow, those are such unique questions. And I think it's really important to emphasize that, like, most coaches do not abuse their athletes, right? The vast majority of coaches are great to their athletes and go into this field with really, really healthy reasons, wanting to support kids in their development. We don't have a whole lot of evidence that people enter the coaching field seeking perpetration, right? Seeking these populations. But what we do know is a risk factor for sexual violence in sport is access. So having access to a population that you may potentially abuse, right? We think of, especially our youth athletes, sort of the intimacy and the access that coaches or medical providers have to young people. We don't really see that reflected in other spaces. More often parents are around or other kids are around, right? But there can be these really unique dynamics in sport in particular. What is more likely of perpetrators, and again, it's rare, right, is that they have these um, things that build up over time, right? And so people are not unwell when they abuse people, when they abuse athletes. They may have their own histories of trauma and violence. They may be, struggling in some way, but what we find is it's power. It is this desire to seek control and power over any one individual is really what determines who ends up abusing. Just because someone has their own trauma history or their own things going on does not mean you become an abuser. It really is people who crave this level of power or control over other people at any cost, right? And so we don't necessarily, want to say that people enter coaching with the purpose of abusing. I don't think that's the case, but over time, if you have these elements of yourself, and then it's coupled with access and vulnerable populations and a really intimate interactions with people, that sort of creates that breeding ground for violence to happen.
Okay. And the vulnerabilities, I assume, is a fear of a loss of a spot on the team or playing time or your career Olympic dreams are over if you were to say something. Like, what are those aspects?
Yeah, it can be a lot of things. Age is a really big one, right? So
Mhm.
athletic participation starts when we're pretty young. Age, gender itself, having gender differences can be a vulnerability. And then there are aspects related to sport, right? So what could it compromise if I were to report that something was happening? Would I be retaliated against? Would I be supported? And unfortunately, we see a lot of evidence of athletes coming out and reporting abuse and maybe not being supported by their institution or their sport governing bodies. And so you see that play out sort of in the media, and it makes you question, is this something that I should do? There's also this aspect of abuse. It's not typically, these high profile things that we see in the media where it was a stranger or someone unfamiliar. These often happen in really small and intimate ways over time, called something like grooming, right? So
Mhm.
coaches may start with something that seems like favoritism or just spending more time, and then again, wanting more power and control over time. So sometimes survivors of sexual violence or violence in general aren't always certain that that's what happened to them at first until they're able to share their stories and seek out support, because sometimes the circumstances surrounding it can be really confusing and manipulative.
Okay. And why do we still see governing bodies or whatever power structures there are around a sport or a team or a league like still not supporting their athletes and standing behind coaches after we've seen multiple cases of this over the years?
Yeah, it's tough because again, we want to hope that, most of our institutions and most of our governing bodies are in the interest of protecting our athletes. And I like to believe that, right? But we do continue to see these examples of institutions that, protected perpetrators or didn't support people who reported or survived violence. And there could be a number of explanations, right? Money is a big one, finances. It is a lot of costs of lawsuits and things that you would be involved in when a report ultimately happens. Protecting the institution's brand or reputation can be a reason. And then unfortunately, there is this sort of societal issue where we don't believe survivors. We don't believe people that come forward and share these things that are happening because the perpetrator, the abuser, looks so different in those moments that they're being abusive than they do on the outside. So maybe we look at these coaches and they're, a family person or they're married or they've contributed so much to the institution in the community, and that all may be true, but that doesn't negate the fact that they may have abused someone as well. So it's
Mm.
hard to survivors. We have a lot of societal beliefs and myths about what it means to report and survive abuse. That unfortunately, the higher up we get in systems, the more the systems want to protect themselves, right? So, a number of reasons that we might not find support. And one of the big issues is our reporting mechanisms. We like to think we have good reporting mechanisms of where and when and how to report, but there's still often just about everywhere confusion about what that looks like. What is reportable? Who does it go to? What happens in the aftermath?
Got it. Okay. Well, this is a probably appropriate time to bring up a subject. So you mentioned about, believing people, and I think one of the most famous cases was the Duke lacrosse case back in the early 2000s, and just had her name was Crystal Mangum, who came out and said that, she wasn't telling the truth when she accused those players of rape. What do you think that her recent statements
Yeah.
mean in this discussion? People be too quick to say, "Oh, look, we can't believe anybody," or this is just a one-off case. What were your thoughts when you heard what she had to say and what this means in your profession?
Yeah, it's unbelievably unfortunate. It's unbelievably unfortunate that that situation happened, and you know, no one can quite understand maybe what was going through her mind or the things that, she was grappling with at the time that she decided to do what she did. But what's really important for people to remember is that false reports of rape and sexual violence are so rare. They are so, so rare. And the one you get, right, the one or the handful that you get over time are going to make it into the media. They're going to be very sensationalized. We're going to hear those stories. And it is unfortunate. No one should ever be falsely accused of something that they didn't do. There are a lot of costs to a person when that happens. But there are also costs to other people who have reported or will report in the future. So really false reports harm everybody in exponential ways. And at the same time, they're very rare. So it's important for folks to maybe not hear that one instance of a false report and assume that everybody else is false reporting, right? when we look at our violence statistics, that a false report for something like rape or sexual assault is no more likely than a false report for any other crime, like a car theft or a murder or anything like that, right? But we don't inherently, when someone comes out and reports this crime happened to them, take a minute to be like, well, wait, did this really happen? You know, people falsely accused. What were you wearing? What were you doing? What was the relationship? We just approach sexual and gender-based violence so much differently than other crimes, right? So super just unfortunate, inappropriate for that to have happened, harms a lot of people. And it's really important that moving forward, we don't take that as a reason to not believe our survivors. So
Mhm.
unfortunately, what's likely to happen after that is less people may feel like they want to come forward when something happens to them out of fear of being called a fake accuser, out of fear of, will I be believed? What will be the repercussions of this? So lots of ripple effects all around for a case like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. In the article, you identified three typical prevention frameworks in sport, and really the I guess the reasons for those frameworks, but also the limitations of them. I wondered if you could walk through those three with us. Uh,
Yes, yes. So, the
Primary prevention
yeah,
being the first. Yeah.
yeah, and I think when people think prevention, we most often think of primary prevention, right? These are our more common programs aimed at reducing sexual misconduct, often in specific populations. So we see a lot of primary prevention on college campuses in particular, and now broadly just other sport environments too. So this would be the thing like, we have a speaker come in and talk about the impact of sexual violence. We have these annual trainings on Title IX for staff and reporting and on, identifying sexual abuse and things like that. That's what we often think of as primary prevention. And that's great, right? It has a reach, it has an impact. But unfortunately, what we find with these primary prevention programs is they're sort of one-offs, right? So we do the 15-minute Title IX talk and we check the box. We do the annual training and we check the box, right? And so they are necessary and we need to do them, but they're often not the most sustainable or integrated. Secondary prevention is the thing that we do in the inevitable event that the harm happens, right? So primary prevention is important, but it's not going to prevent all incidences of sexual violence. So in that secondary level, that's when we come in and we respond when this harm has happened, right? So how do we respond and promote healing to the people that have been impacted in a sport environment? Recognizing that it's often more than just the individual who's been abused that's been impacted. It's often their teammates, the system in general, the trust that can be shaken, the recruiting, like lots of harms can happen to a lot of people involved. So how
Mhm.
do we make sure that these survivors are supported through any means possible and create these trauma-informed environments moving forward? And then we've got the tertiary prevention, which is, I think, the least talked about, but it's like, how do we address the long-term effects of sexual misconduct and how do we prevent these things from happening again in the future, right? Primary prevention doesn't really touch on that. It doesn't touch on, okay, these things have happened, they exist, they impact our culture, and how do we change our culture over time? So these are the things in response to often like the perpetrators. What do we do when we find out a coach has behaved in this way or that an institution covered up this thing? What are the appropriate sanctions? How do we provide, intervention to the folks who have perpetrated that maybe based on their offense, they stick around, right? So they're still able to participate in their sport, but they've committed an offense that at least warrants some type of educational intervention. And then how do we, in the long term, ensure that our reporting mechanisms are in place for these kind of incidents in the future and make sure we have ongoing support for survivors? So we start at that primary prevention. The hope is you can prevent all forms of sexual misconduct. That's not the reality. Secondary is we stepped in that immediate aftermath when these things happen. And then tertiary is how do we, in the long term, respond and prevent these incidents from happening again?
Yeah, okay, great. And then you identified three existing challenges from insufficient integration, systemic gaps, and inadequate representation. What did you mean by each of those three areas?
Yeah. So insufficient. integration is sort of what I mentioned is that, often it's these brief one-time interventions that we expose our athletes or our people working in sport to, and there's no follow-up, right? So they really reduce the ability to enact lasting change over time and shift our systems and cultures towards preventing sexual violence from happening ever, right? And so they're important. We need to do them, but they often feel sort of like a checkbox, and then we don't check back in. We don't reassess the climate. We don't see what's going on. System gaps, this is sort of like the structural issues that we talked about of like, why does sexual violence happen at higher rates in sport in the first place? Okay. So, yes, a lot of our interventions are targeted at, okay, what do you do if you're in a situation to keep yourself safe? Or how do you, as a perpetrator, recognize these acts that you might be committing in? But what we need to recognize is it's these broader systems, societal impacts, cultures that actually create the breeding ground for these things to happen. And that's really the work that needs to be done, is how do we look at the system itself? What are the policies we have or don't have in place? What are the reporting mechanisms and are they really clear? And do we have some of these factors in our culture that are risk factors? Misogyny, aggression, violence, silence, cultures of silence, power structures, things like that. Other forms of abuse, even smaller. What we know is when there's certain forms of abuse, we're more likely to see elevated rates of abuse over time. So, how are we really looking at our systems and finding those vulnerability spots?
Okay. You can
Yep.
hear noise behind me. This is an athletic department. It's not always a quiet
I
office,
understand,
right?
that's for sure. Yeah. Yes. The last one is inadequate representation. So
Mhm.
unfortunately, a lot of these programs were created relatively quickly in an effort to respond to elevated rates of sexual violence on campuses. I think when those numbers first came out, people were really surprised that the rates were so high, right? And so everyone's like, we need to do something, we need to respond. And that was super appropriate at the time, right? But over time, what we haven't done a great job of is really recognizing that there are certain demographics and populations that may be more vulnerable to things like gender-based violence. So that's, intersections of race and gender identity and disability and sexual orientation, and failing to sort of address the unique vulnerabilities that might take place within those populations. So those are really the three existing challenges. We do pretty good with our primary prevention, right? But why do we continue to see these high profile cases and these rates exist at the levels that they do? These are often the areas that we ignore.
Okay. And then to wrap up your article, you identified 5 areas for change, and I wondered if you could walk us through those.
Sure. Yes. Number one, distributed and integrated programming. So, what I just mentioned, they need to be longer in duration or repeated regularly or tailored to the needs of specific communities, like athletes. We do have some programs that are specifically tailored to athletes, but even within that, we don't often address these intersections of, gender and specific for coaches versus student athletes, things like that. There's so many things we could do to make them tailored. And even more important than that, I think, is acknowledging the systematic nature of sexual violence in sports. So we can't just look at the individual level of, how do potential survivors keep themselves safe and how do perpetrators not perpetrate, right? We need to look at these systems and the broader cultures where it happens and really emphasize kind of that safety and well-being of entire sport communities. Number two is leadership, using leadership, right? And so, when our coaches and our sport administrators and our governing bodies are the ones who say these things, people listen. We often have student athletes or, other staff members that are maybe engaged in sexual violence prevention through campus committees or through, the work that they do on their own or writing or publishing, right? But until the people really at the top with the most power, those are the folks that play a critical role in shaping team and organizational cultures. So we need to hear this message for them, right? Being actively involved in these zero tolerance policies. So when you're a coach and you find out this is happening on your team, what do you do? Do you act swiftly? Do you believe survivors? Do you put in appropriate sanctions? Or do you participate in that culture of silence and, protecting the brand, right? Our leaders have to decide how they want to play a role in this. Similarly is institutional accountability. So the institutions themselves need to take a look at what gaps they have. Do they have transparent policies? Where can you see the sexual misconduct policy? Who does it apply to? Have you done a climate survey to assess risks that might already exist in your organization? It's really big on college campuses right now is these climate surveys to see like, hey, what do our rates actually look like? Who is most affected? What are the beliefs and the culture aspects on our campus that promote this type of behavior? We should be doing climate assessments within sport organizations too to really see, where are these issues kind of centralized and where do they come from? And then sanctions, right? One of the biggest things is we wait a long time to decide how do we respond and how do we sanction. And we need to be ethical in that. And we need to consider everything at play, right? But like sanctions need to happen before it makes it to the media and we find out nothing ever happened, right? That's what really plays the biggest cost financially, reputationally for institutions and governing bodies is when they did nothing, right? So without any form of accountability, these policies we have in place are just aspirational and we're bound to, not abide by them. Number four is targeting our cultural norms. So yes, of course, the goal is like don't perpetrate, don't, sexually assault people, but there's a lot of things that happen before someone gets to that place. And when we were talking about coaches, they don't often go and abuse an athlete on the first encounter, right? So it's some of the beliefs that we hold, things like toxic masculinity, that, being a male means that you inherently should have power over people. Rape myths, which are things like, well, these type of people are more likely to false report or more deserving of things to happen to them, or if you are acting this way or dressing this way, you may deserve it. People are far more likely to endorse these type of ideologies than they are violence itself, right? So how do we catch the folks who do believe that most women falsely report or that, men cannot be sexually assaulted? Who are the folks that believe these things? And that's where we target our interventions. A way to do this really influentially is, our leaders, right? So our captains and our members of, our squads and our teams that have a lot of influence, how do they help advocate to shift these norms and behaviors among their peers? The last thing, and I write and talk a lot about this, is the idea of creating trauma-informed sport environments. This is not aspirational. This is something that we can do. So when we think about our policies and our response mechanisms and the prevention efforts we put at place, it should be survivor focused. Our survivors of sexual violence should be at the center of any kind of prevention and response efforts that we have. So we should prioritize these voices and their stories. What do they want to see? What were the things that broke down that allowed them to experience violence, right? So any kind of policies and resources in the aftermath of sexual violence, any kind of sanctions in the way that we respond, survivors really should be able to have a say in that.
Wow. I mean, this is a little bit of a political question, I guess, but just our society right now, when you talk about like leaders need to set the right tone, like you don't always see that from leaders in more important areas than sports, or cultural norms. You read a lot about the influences on teenage boys right now, and like even middle school, and from social media, the messages that they're receiving. You think about just fandom and people being willing to excuse what happens within their favorite team, but quick to criticize what happens somewhere else, but they're going to protect what they care about. I mean, it seems like you're up against so much in trying to achieve progress within sport when so many things in culture around sport are not necessarily moving in the right direction. I mean, like, do you feel that in your business?
I mean, absolutely, yes. I think when we have really high profile and powerful people talking openly about sexual assault or, kind of getting away with things, right? Despite really credible survivors sharing their stories, two things happen. One, folks that hold these beliefs and, are considering, do I engage in a certain behavior, become emboldened to do those things. They believe that it is okay. They believe that they are owed something. And then on the other side, it terrifies survivors of what would happen to me if I did share my story and I did come out. Even if people believe me, would they care? Would they do anything? And I think we're seeing this play out in our society. So, sexual violence is not one gender, right? Men in sport are perpetrated against, but what we do know is that the vast majority of perpetrators are male. That's not that women in sport do not abuse others, that does happen. Victims are all genders, but predominantly our perpetrators are male. And so when we look at sexual violence prevention, a lot of the voices in that space are female, but what we really need are are men to kind of step up and share this message and say, we don't talk about people that way. We don't use that kind of language. We're not okay with that kind of behavior. And when we have men in these really powerful spaces that are willing to come out and say, like, we don't do that here. We don't talk about that here, right? Like, we don't use that kind of
Mhm.
language, degrading language about people, that's not tolerated here. Young people listen to that, and especially young boys who then become older and hear these messages over time and might be at risk of becoming a perpetrator. They're looking up to the men in their lives to hear that message. And when that message is not a resounding, like, no, we don't tolerate that here, it leaves a lot of room for people to guess of like, okay, what really is acceptable in society?
hmm Okay, yeah, and that gets, I mean, I think about Shane Foster, the work he does for Men Together, and I've heard him mention, this is not, it's a men's issue. If it was up to women, like we wouldn't be dealing with this right now. And so I wanted to ask you, like, what can we all do just as sports fans or just as, citizens of the country, like to help in this area? And it sounds like as parents or as youth coaches or listening to what our kids' coaches are saying, speaking up is a big piece of it. But like, what is your recommendation to people watching this who have no influence really in day-to-day lives of athletes other than maybe their kids? But what can we all do to contribute?
Yeah, I think the easiest thing to start with is to talk about it, right? Talking about sexual violence cannot be taboo because it happens and it happens on a daily basis. So don't be afraid to talk about it and ask about it and be curious. So if you've got kids participating in sport, ask organization like, what are the policies in place for something happen? What is the prevention? How do we make sure that our youth aren't alone with folks. Has there been any history of that kind of report in the past, right? Same with our governing bodies at all levels of sport, is we should be curious and ask the questions and demand some answers, right? Like we should know where athletes go to report, who they can be safe with, what are the policies around, what are we doing for primary prevention? So I think no matter where you're at, you get to be curious and ask those questions. And then the biggest one is like believe survivors the first time they tell you. And this is so hard to say, right? When we've got this high profile case, but the first thing we want to do is believe survivors, and the investigation is not our responsibility. Most folks involved in this, we are not the people investigating. We want to trust the people investigating, right? But like we should ask questions. We should support survivors when they first come out and not assume that they're false reporting, when again, what we know is that the rate of false report is just overwhelmingly small, right? And so be there for the people in your life and challenge these kind of micro systems that contribute to environments of sexual violence. So most of us are not going to be in a situation where we can prevent a sexual assault. That's not the case for a lot of athletes. You may be in those situations where you can do that, great. But for the rest of us, what is the language in your workplace, in your family? How do people talk about abuse? How do people talk about the other gender, right? What kind of language is acceptable? Are there cultures of consent in your family and your workplaces? Do people ask for permission? Is there toxic masculinity, right? Is there this assumption that, one gender is superior over the other and gets to make more decisions, things like that. And so I think we can all just take a look at our lives and be curious and challenge some of these systems and cultures around us, and then believe survivors when they come forward.
This has been a great discussion, and I know, like I mentioned at the beginning, that you write on this and other topics. For people who are interested in learning more from you, where can they find you online or find what you've written?
Sure, sure. So Psychology Today is where I predominantly provide my writings on, topics often at the intersection of sport, but sometimes related broadly to trauma. So you can find me under Dr. Tess Kilwein on Psychology Today and read some of my articles. And then I also have a website, unapologeticsych.com, where I provide some additional information and training and different things related to this area.
All right. Well, Dr. Kilwine, thank you for your time. Happy holidays. I'll see you around the building, but really appreciate you taking the time to join the show today. Take care.
Thanks for having me, Andrew.